Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever live stream. We're very excited to have a guest speaker with us today, David Mizejewski, naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation. You may recognize him from some of our content. He's featured in our How to Plant Your Native Plants video, which is very popular. And he's going to give us some really great tips on planting native today, answering your questions live. We're so excited to have you. Thank you for joining us, David.
Of course. Thanks, Julie. I'm thrilled to be here. For folks that are joining us, a little bit more about me. I've been with the National Wildlife Federation for 25 years. Just had my 25th anniversary, kind of crazy. I actually came to the Wildlife Federation in the year 2000 to actually run all of our Garden for Wildlife work. And so it's obviously something that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm a lifelong nature geek. I got into native plants back in the 90s. Before anyone was really talking about it. And so I am so excited to be here with everybody today and hopefully answer some of your questions so that you can get even more into planting native plants, restoring habitat for birds and butterflies and native bees and all the other cool wildlife species that we can share this planet with literally right outside our door if we just give them a little bit of habitat. One shameless plug, I do have a book. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. And I guarantee you anything we talk about today will be covered in the book. So it's a great resource if you want to have something sort of tangible after this. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. And if you're watching, I'd love to know where folks are. So drop that in the chat, and I think you can drop your questions there too. But I think, Julie, you'll probably go over the nuts and the bolts of how this is going to work.
Yes, absolutely. I do see Sylvia from Vienna, Virginia jumped into the chat. So hi, Sylvia. Everyone else, as you're jumping on, feel free to let us know where you're joining from. That will be important when we're talking about native species because every plant is native somewhere. But we're primarily going to be focusing on North America, United States native species. We've got Debbie from Fry's, Virginia. Is that a place? Fry's, Virginia? I never knew that. I'm from Maryland, so I'm going to have to go visit that place. Ohio, Oklahoma. This is great. Thank you, guys. So we have a couple of kind of starter questions that we're just going to run through, burning questions that we see a lot from the Garden for Wildlife side. We do also want to touch a little bit about why fall is the best time to plant native species. That's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people that want to garden. You kind of want to start planting when the birds start singing and the sun comes out and it's springtime, but it's actually better to plant them in the fall. So David, can you talk a little bit about why it's better to plant native species in the fall?
Yeah, it's a really great place to start because obviously we are sort of at the threshold of autumn at this time of the year. And I mean, it's really all about dormancy. And obviously, I'm going to be speaking very broadly. I should mention I'm based in New Jersey, and so I know gardening situations and native plant communities are totally different in different regions, right? So some of this may or may not apply as much to where you are, but generally speaking, across the continent, in the fall, plants start their dormancy, and all plants have some form of dormancy. It's not just the deciduous trees that drop their leaves. Even evergreen trees will sort of slow down. And of course, our herbaceous plants, so plants that don't have woody stems, so in other words, not trees and shrubs, they are going to live year to year. That's what perennial means. But their top green parts and their flowering parts die back at this time of year, but the roots persist, in the soil, growing so that the plant can sprout again in the spring. And so one of the biggest risks when you plant a new plant is what we call transplant shock. And essentially what that mostly is dehydration. So when you plant in the fall, just as the plants are going into their dormancy, or even if they're already dormant, as long as you can dig into the ground and it's not frozen, the plant does not have to worry about losing all of its moisture through evaporation through its leaves because it's not going to either have leaves at all or its photosynthesis is going to really have slowed down. And so you just eliminate that whole risk of transplant shock and dehydration that can actually kill newly planted plants unless you're giving them lots of care and water. And that's true even for native plants. We always talk about native plants are great because generally speaking, in the big picture, long term, they don't need a lot of the extra care and maintenance that a lot of non-native ornamentals need, like extra watering. But in the beginning, when you plant a plant in the ground, whether it's native or not, it's still going to need a little bit of care. You're going to need to water it until its roots get established. So again, planting in the fall eliminates a lot of that risk. And the other thing that I love about planting in the fall is that you do all this work, now in September and October or November, whatever fall is where you are. And then you get into the holidays, and then it's winter, and then it's, come March or April, suddenly all of these incredible plants that you put into the ground 4, 5, 6 months earlier that you kind of forgot about start coming up. And the fact that you don't have to do all of that work in the spring is always a nice little gift to myself that I always thank myself for. So that's really it in a nutshell. It's easier on the plants to get established. Their roots get established in that soil in the fall and the winter, so they're ready to go when spring rolls around.
Yeah, so this is reminding me, this is the time of year when we tend to promote our early spring bloomers, because if you plant them now, they're going to pop up first. They're going to be there for the butterflies and the bees and all the early pollinators. My Jacob's Ladder plants were some of the first ones to bloom this year, and then our Eastern Columbine. All very beautiful, and I'm excited. So I started planting last year. I'm excited to watch them grow and just fill out in the next year or so, because native plants will spread for the most part. So you're getting a lot of value when you plant them. They're going to take up more space over time.
Yeah, I do want to address the question or the comment from Jane.
I was going to say the same thing, David. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jane.
Yeah, it is a great question. And yes, I mean, most of what we're going to talk about is generally going to apply to pretty much everywhere in the country. But if you have some specific questions about the Pacific Northwest, please do, drop them, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm a generalist, so even though I'm an East Coaster, hopefully I'll still be able to answer you. And if not, at the National Wildlife Federation, we implement these programs, these native plant habitat programs all around the country. And we actually have staff based in Seattle, and we do have regional resources. So we can, we can get those to you, or you can reach out to us directly and we can connect you. And by the way, I don't know how close you are, if you are in the Seattle area, but I usually speak at the Northwest Flower and Garden Festival in Seattle every February. So that's another opportunity to come out and maybe meet in person and get your questions answered. So
I was just going to say, aren't you going to an event soon in the Pacific Northwest? I love that question because we actually just expanded our services this year to cover the full continental United States. So we are now in the West. We are in the Pacific Northwest. Would definitely like to know what your specific questions are that we can address today. That said, we had a couple of general questions that we were using to promote this event. So I do want to run through those. Because I know a lot of people ask these questions. They think about these topics a lot. So one of the main drivers of planting milkweed is to bring the monarchs to your garden. It's to help rebound their populations. So what would you say to someone who planted milkweed, but they're not seeing the monarchs yet? What can they do?
Yeah. So there's a lot to say about this. So just to recap for anybody not familiar, monarch butterflies, the big, beautiful orange and black butterflies, used to be very common, super common all across the country. Two populations, the eastern, which is everything east of the Rockies, the western, west of the Rockies. Same species, but just, two different populations, a little bit of a different migration behavior. And like most, butterflies, they're feeding on flower nectar as adults, but their caterpillar host plant, it's just the only thing that a caterpillar of a butterfly or moth can eat that's different for every species is milkweed. And so milkweed is the only plant that monarch caterpillars can eat. Now, there are something like 96 species of milkweed and some subspecies. So no matter where you live, there are milkweed species native to where you are. And Jane, I see your question. One of the things that you're looking for is milkweed that is actually native to the Pacific Northwest. There's layers to that question, but very quickly, showy milkweed is native up there. Butterfly weed is native up there. There are some others that are probably not in big cultivation that you might seek out from native plant societies and things like that. But at any rate, people are wanting to plant the milkweed not only to attract the monarch butterflies because they're beautiful and they're amazing, but because sadly, the monarch butterfly populations have absolutely crashed, largely due to wide-scale habitat loss in the form of getting rid of native plants, including milkweed, as well as overuse of pesticides, both at the home level, but also, big agriculture. Climate change is a factor as well, but they're really in trouble. They're actually proposed to be listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. So that's still in process. We haven't gotten the final word on that. But the idea that we all can do something literally right outside our door in our own communities and neighborhoods that could actually help this wonderful, iconic North American butterfly species recover is huge. It's so powerful when we can take those personal actions and make a difference. And so that is really one of the main reasons why we at the National Wildlife Federation, why Garden for Wildlife is really actively promoting people planting milkweed, because the monarchs need it. Now, this is a long game. Okay. We're not going to turn this around overnight, even though, unlike other kinds of wildlife, I don't know, like say whales or polar bears or something, mammals, their recovery takes much longer because they only breed every year, every few years, that kind of thing. Insects typically are able to reproduce en masse every single year. So that's why the monarch population numbers sometimes go up and down from year to year, because they might have a good year and their population bumps up by a significant amount, but then one freak winter storm, extreme weather event then wipes out 2/3 of the population the next year. So but the main thing that I want everybody to hear is planting the milkweed and planting the other native plants like nectar plants, even if you're not immediately seeing monarchs, is so super important to do. Because if I do it and you do it and your neighbor does it, eventually there will be the habitat that you have to have in the first place if the populations are going to recover. And that's really what it boils down to. You cannot have healthy wildlife populations unless you have healthy habitat. And native plants are the foundation of the entire, habitat for wildlife. That's why, by the way, a wildlife conservation organization like the National Wildlife Federation has a garden program in the first place. It's because plants or wildlife need plants to survive. So the idea is that if we are increasing the number of, or the amount of milkweed and other native nectar plants over time, and we're doing it consistently, we're going to begin slowly but exponentially increasing the habitat. So that's sort of the big picture answer there. There are some other things that could be happening on the sort of more the smaller scale. So sad to say, and I see this in my very own neighborhood, people are spraying all sorts of pesticides all over their yards. More and more, I'm seeing people hire companies, mosquito companies, to come and broadcast broad spectrum insecticides all over their yards. So maybe you plant the habitat and you're not seeing very many monarchs this year. It could be that they fell victim to local spraying, and that's a local thing. It's also a bigger picture fight that we're trying to really have, is trying to educate people why doing that is really bad, and how there are actually much better ways to minimize your chances of being bitten by mosquitoes. We've got a whole blog series on this, and I talk about it in my book. So so I guess my short message there is, like, keep the faith, keep planting the milkweed, and eventually, if we do this successfully, the monarchs, there will be enough of them where they will show up and you will have success and you'll be able to see and enjoy them. But even better, you'll know that you've helped the population recover.
I saw 3 monarch butterflies around town just the other day, so I'm very excited about that. I don't see them that often, so hopefully more people are getting the message, and we are going to make an impact and be able to help them.
Yeah.
I see a question from. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I've seen a good amount this year where I am. They start showing up around this time of year, but I do just wanted to add that addendum that just like if you don't see a lot of monarchs, doesn't mean that they're not out there. Even, you seeing 3 or 4 monarchs, and maybe that's twice as many as you saw last year, doesn't necessarily mean that in the big picture, the population is recovering. So it's just, I just encourage people to think to be mindful of that, because I hear from a lot of people that panic because they don't see any monarchs,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa. Like, I see monarchs all the time. They're not in trouble. And you really have to look at this like scientists and wildlife conservationists do from the macro scale, to really kind of know what's going on. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. I'm seeing some conversation about aphids in the chat right now, which is perfect because that is one of our talking points. Steven said he fed the aphids this year. They need food too. Patty said her milkweed gets aphids, but they attract ladybugs that eat the aphids. I know they can be a little jarring when they start appearing and then they spread very quickly. Can you talk about aphids and maybe get people to calm down a little bit so when they see them, they don't freak out?
Yeah, I'm with everybody that is like an aphid hater, because they are so annoying in the garden, right? Particularly those oleander aphids that are the ones that show up in the milkweeds that are sort of the bright orange, because they're actually not even a native species here. And they seem like they're overwhelming the plant. But even the oleander aphids generally, first and foremost, they're not going to kill the plant. And that's I think one of the most important things. So if you know that a healthy milkweed plant isn't going to fully succumb, or a whole patch isn't going to succumb just because it has a lot of aphids on it, I think that helps us get over the second issue, which is really the aesthetics of it, right? Because they can really get on the tips and cause some die off on those tips, and they don't look that great or whatever. But here's the thing: no matter what you do to kill the aphids, there's always a good chance that you're killing off stuff that you don't want to kill off, whether it is ladybugs or monarch caterpillars, right? So if you're spraying pesticides on there, you're going to kill all the insects, including the beneficials. Even if you're doing what we often recommend in organic gardening, chemical-free gardening, is like use a spray of water to blow them off. There might be some monarch caterpillars that you're doing the same to. So my personal way of dealing with them is to just accept that they exist and kind of not obsess about it and just let nature take its course. I know that's not going to be the answer everybody wants to hear, but I personally would rather look at some creepy looking aphids and maybe some a little bedraggled looking milkweed plants than be spraying pesticides everywhere. If you really do have to deal with them, I would recommend either the spray technique, water spray, or just and if you put a glove on if you want, just squish them, run your finger down and squish them. And that maybe is a little bit, cathartic and satisfying to do if you're really not a big fan of aphids.
I'm trying to embrace them. It is about building the whole ecosystem and kind of letting nature take its course. I'm seeing so many great questions. Okay, so I'm seeing a few questions around plants with yellowing leaves and the leaves falling off. What's your thought on that? I think that might tie into a question around like, what are some common mistakes people make when they start planting native species? So what do you think initially when you hear that the plants have yellowing leaves and the leaves are falling off?
Yeah, so I think here is where I think it's okay to pivot to sort of gardening, right? Mm-hmm. Reading up on sort of conventional gardening, because anytime you see anything going on with a plant that maybe looks not right, there's a whole series of things that could be causing it, right? So you almost have to be a little bit of a detective. So those things could include anything from not enough water, too much water. Mm-hmm. It could be a pest. It could be too much sun for that particular species of plant. It could be too much shade for that particular species of plant. It might even just be that the plant is going dormant for the year, right? So it's really, what I would say, important to just understand a little bit about the plant species that you've already planted or already exist, or that you're thinking about planting. Because again, that mantra of right plant, right place is so important. Even if you're planting native species to your region, if you plant them in a spot in your yard that is not ideal for that particular plant species preferences, right? How much sun, how moist is the soil? What's the nutrient level in the soil? That's another reason why plants might yellow. There might not be enough nutrients in the soil, or there might be too much. So it could be either or in all of these scenarios. So again, first thing is knowing what plants you're planting and what kind of conditions they like, and then making sure you're putting them in those conditions, right? So again, if you plant a shade-loving native plant in full sun, it's probably going to burn up and turn yellow, and vice versa. So start there. Then where I would go is, again, just sort of be a sleuth, be a good naturalist, right? What we are as naturalists are just observers of nature. And, anybody can be a naturalist. So go out and just observe, look at the plant. Are there pests on it? Are there insects on it, or other things, right? Stick your finger down into the soil, and like your whole finger, not just like the top half an inch. Get down like as far as your finger will go. Is the soil wet? Is it dry? Is it compacted so bad that you can't get your finger down there? Well, maybe the plant roots are compacted, right? So these things are all clues on things that might be causing your plant to yellow. Another thing that you can do is like a soil test. And a lot of extension services will do this. You can buy them. I don't know how great they are if you're buying them sort of from a big box store or whatever, but you can try them. And that will tell you sort of the nutrient levels of your soil. And then you can, again, read up on your plant. So like in my yard, for example, I live in a house that's almost 100 years old. The landscape, it's compacted soil. It's probably really depleted. I haven't done a soil test yet, but and a lot of it is heavy shade and it's dry, which is like the absolute worst growing conditions. And I've really struggled to get woodland, shade-loving plants to grow. And I kind of figured out that it was probably because the soil was lacking in nutrients. So I've begun using a locally produced organic fertilizer made of compost and composted chicken droppings, and adding that to my fallen leaf layer and my natural composted wood chip mulch that I use. And I saw immediate instant differences. My plants were more robust. I wasn't getting the yellowing. They weren't drying out. So unfortunately, I don't have one answer to that, right? There's a lot of different reasons why your plant might be turning yellow, but again, have fun with it. You're on a journey. It's okay if a plant dies, right? I mean, we all hate that and we don't want to waste the money, but that's how we learn. And maybe that plant isn't a good fit for you. So, but you'll know if you lose a plant because of XYZ condition, to then you'll know what to look for in its replacement. And then you'll pick something with that knowledge that actually will probably thrive there. So yeah, it's a journey.
Yeah, I've lost a few that I put in an area with too much shade, and they were like, no, this isn't going to work for us.
Yeah.
But in terms of mistakes that we see customers make when they are first planting native, overwatering is a big one. You wouldn't think that. And it's just, these species don't need as much water. And so when they're first getting established, definitely put your finger in the soil, make sure that the soil is moist for at least the first couple of weeks. But right now, I don't have to water my new plants as much because the ground is staying wet when I water it. So if I was watering them every day, I think I would drown them.
Yeah, I have overwatered stuff and drowned plants. I mean, everyone, again, don't be afraid if it happens, because it happens to everyone, even people that have been gardening with native plants for decades. That's a really important point, that, again, just knowing the conditions that your plants naturally grow in the wild and then mimicking them. My big thing for knowing when I need to water is, well, two things. One, the leaves will start to flag. That means they sort of droop a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a sign immediately that your plant maybe is getting a little bit thirsty. If I see that, I will check the soil. I'll just touch it. Sometimes I can tell just by looking at it, and you can see it's really dry. That's when I'm going to water. And so, again, there's things you can do that are pretty simple that will give you clues on what the situation is. Now, if you do that and the soil is soaking wet, then that's a clue that maybe you're overwatering. So, yeah.
The other thing we see too is mulch, just too much mulch, trying to suppress the weeds while the plants are getting established, putting the mulch too close to the plant so that it doesn't have the proper airflow. I mean, you can essentially smother it that way just by burying it in mulch.
Yeah, especially little plugs and smaller plants. The benefit of plugs is that they're more affordable. You can get more of them. They're easier to plant for sure, especially if you have compacted soil, but it's very easy to smother them with mulch. And, I typically, when I'm planting sort of a new bed, I will plant just a little bit higher up than like the recommendation, which should be, with whatever planting container the plant is in, generally the surface should be at the exact same level, right? And what happens often, you plant it at soil level, and then you come back in and you put, a couple inches of mulch, and then suddenly the plant is below grade. So it's okay to have the, mulch be a little bit higher than the soil, but a few inches sometimes, especially for small plug type plants and young plants, could be too much. So I will always leave them just a little bit higher than the surface, knowing that I'm going to, come back in and mulch around them. And so the roots will be able to, get the benefits of the moisture that the mulch is going to retain. And as the mulch composts down, it turns into soil. So the roots will be, eventually well protected. So that's just another tip.
Yeah, it's what works for you and your plants, just kind of finding that right balance. I see this really great question from Susan about what are the best plants, like best bang for your buck native species. And then she specifically asked what plants support the greatest diversity of species, which immediately reminds me of Keystone species.
Correct.
And I'm sure you have many things to say about that.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that answer really depends on where you are. Because if you're just joining us, we were talking at the very beginning about how North America has incredible plant diversity, and we have folks from all over the country on this, watching us right now. So my answers are for most of these things are going to be general, and what your best bet is to seek out resources specific to your region, and it just so happens that Garden for Wildlife and the National Wildlife Federation, we do have a lot of those kinds of resources. So Julie just used the word keystone species. So what's a keystone species? This is a term that we use in conservation science and biology and ecology to talk about species that have kind of like a bigger impact on the ecosystem, or the biggest impact on the ecosystem. Because they are a source of food or habitat in some other way, shape, or form for a large number of other species. So to give an animal example, think about beavers, right? Beavers, they chop down trees, they dam up streams, and they create these big wetland areas, which is habitat for beavers, right? Those wetland areas give them safe places to hide from predators. They build their lodges, they have their babies. But in the meantime, those wetlands that they create then are populated by hundreds or thousands of different other species that wouldn't have habitat there unless the beavers made it, right? So plants, wading birds, waterfowl, amphibians, fish, etc., depend on the beaver. Beavers are a keystone wildlife species. But the same is true for plants. There are a lot of plant species that support a really high number of wildlife species, for example. So one of them, the one that gets talked about the most, are oaks. So the genus Quercus is the genus that oaks belong to. And oaks come in the form of giant canopy trees to smaller, scrubby, almost shrub-like woody plants. Oaks produce acorns. And that's one of the first things that we think of is like, oh, how does the oak tree feed wildlife? Well, they do. They produce acorns, which are fed upon by everything from squirrels and, chipmunks and other rodents, but also to deer, to bear, and to wild turkeys, to jays love eating acorns. So they do support a high number of mammals. But the thing that's crazy about oaks that still I don't think there's a great awareness about is that they are incredible caterpillar host plants. The genus Quercus, all of the different species collectively support the caterpillars of at least 557 species of butterflies and moths as the caterpillar host plant. So it's funny, like I always have fun with this because people are like, oh, I want to plant a butterfly garden. And they're thinking in their mind, oh, it's going to be a bunch of pretty flowers, wildflowers and whatnot. And I'm like, plant an oak tree because it does, it's a keystone species. Another one is Solidago, which is goldenrod. So now we're getting away from the woody plants, getting into the herbaceous plants, the perennial plants. Again, there are many, many species of goldenrod. What's going to be the native one by you is going to depend. So again, I would, use the native plant finder that the National Wildlife Federation has, where you can put in your zip code and will give you the list of Keystone's plants that are native to your ecosystem. Garden for Wildlife, all of the plants that Garden for Wildlife is selling are Keystone plants. We have worked together to pick and curate these plants so that you don't have to worry about it. When you get the plants, they're going to be supporting the maximum numbers of native bee species, of butterflies and moths, of songbirds, and then all the other wildlife in the ecosystem. So that's what a Keystone plant is. And again, you want to look for plants that are providing nectar to all of the nectar-eating insects. So that includes butterflies and some moths. It includes all of our diverse native bee species. It includes hummingbirds, right? And lots of other insects feed on nectar and pollen. There's so many different flies and beetles and other insects that are pollinators that need that food resource. Excuse me. Another way that Keystone plants are helping the wildlife in our own yards and gardens is as a pollen source for a group of our native bees that are called, the term is oligolectic. And what that means is that they are pollen specialists that feed their babies the pollen, but they can't feed them any old pollen. They can only feed them the pollen from specific native plants that they co-evolved with. It's just like the monarch butterflies and the milkweed, right? But a big percentage of our bees in North America, the stats vary. I've seen anywhere from 30% to as much as 60%. I think it's a field that's still being researched, but a huge percentage of our native bee species are these pollen specialist bees. So again, if you want to seek out Keystone plants that feed the most numbers of these pollen specialist bees. So those are just a couple examples of some of the two of probably the number one woody plant, which is the oak, the Quercus genus, as a Keystone plant. And then the number one herbaceous plant is the goldenrod. We do have lists. Like I mentioned, the native plant finder. If you just Google native plant finder, National Wildlife Federation, you'll find it. It's probably linked on the Garden for Wildlife website. We also have regional Keystone plant printable PDFs that list out by region some of the top Keystone plants for your region. Again, many of these species you can buy right through Garden for Wildlife. So definitely check that out. And I don't know how to drop. I'm not seeing the chat box here where I can add a chat. Otherwise, I would. I try to drop some of these links in here. But feel free to reach out either to Garden for Wildlife on any of their socials. You can reach out to me. My name is right there. I'm on pretty much every social media platform as well. If you have any questions that we don't get to, if you want to ask more questions or ask for resources, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're already at 6:30 and there's probably 20 more questions. So anyway, I invite you to do that because we're probably not going to be able to answer everybody's questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking that we're going to have to do a follow-up blog post or something where we provide some of the answers to these questions. I have two oaks. I have a white oak and a pin oak, and the white oak is very small, growing very slowly. But I'm sure it's going to just be amazing in 50 years.
Yeah. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago is how the saying goes. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it now. Right. So
yeah. I'm actually really excited about the pin oak. That one has been growing pretty fast and is pretty sizable at this point. So that one's more exciting to watch grow for sure. Yeah. As we are kind of coming up on time, I thought something we could use to wrap up the session here. I do see some questions around fall maintenance for native plants. So if you are planting in the fall, how do you maintain the plants kind of going into the winter? From my perspective, they're super low maintenance, but I'd love to hear what you say about, do you have to do any fall maintenance on your native plants?
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to everything I was saying earlier about it really is so important to just know your plants, right? And make sure you're planting them in the right place for their needs. Again, even a native plant, is not going to thrive if you don't plant it in the habitat that it wants. So sun, shade, water, whatever, right? If you do that, there's almost no maintenance. Once you get them established, if you're planting herbaceous perennial plants or other, or grasses or ferns or, things that are going to go dormant on the top and their roots are going to survive, there's really not much you have to do. They're going to die back in the fall. What you can do is practice not doing anything. And so what I mean by that is that conventional gardening advice that you're going to start seeing here, in all the blogs and all the magazines and all the shows is do your fall cleanup, go in and, cut back all the stems and blow or rake away all of the fallen leaves. And those are two of the worst things that you can do when it comes to fall maintenance. The best fall maintenance is no fall maintenance in my book, because those stems of your herbaceous plants are filled with seeds. If they have been successfully pollinated in the summer, they're going to be filled with seeds that are going to feed birds and other animals throughout the fall into the winter. So you're literally throwing away bird food if you are cutting those stems back and getting rid of them. The other thing that those stems are good for is that there's a huge number, again, of our native bees that actually nest in them. They lay their eggs in them. And most of our native bee species, like 90% of the 4,000 or so bee species that are native to North America, do not live in hives. They don't have queens. They don't make honey. Many of them are not black and yellow, and they're almost never going to sting you. So like everything you think about bees is wrong, because it only applies to like honeybees. But most of those bees, a good number of them, are nesting in hollowed out plant stems. So come spring, after the birds have eaten the seed heads, you can chop those stems down anywhere from like 8 inches to 24 inches, and all the native bees are going to nest in them. And then in the spring, all the new growth is going to cover up those old stems very fast, so you won't even see them. So in the fall, really important to leave those stems. So again, the fall maintenance is no maintenance. And then the other big thing that I really, really strongly encourage everybody to do is leave your leaves, as many of them as you can. If you live somewhere where you do have deciduous trees that drop their leaves, or even evergreens, a lot of evergreens do drop their needles, just not all of them. The fallen leaf layer is critical wildlife habitat for thousands of species. Yes, earthworms and isopods and other creepy crawlies, but also salamanders, also shrews and other insectivores, also cute little chipmunks. All sorts of little critters are living under that leaf litter. Speaking of mammals, there's a bat that we have in the eastern part of the country called the eastern red bat that actually hibernates underneath the fallen leaves. They roost in trees in the winter, but if the temperature gets below freezing, they drop down to the ground and bury themselves in the leaves for extra insulation. So all sorts of creatures are living in there. One of the most important ones, though, are our moths, which are really important pollinators, critical in the food web. 96% of our backyard birds are feeding their babies the caterpillars of moths and butterflies as a primary food source. And guess where those moths are spending the winter? A huge percentage of our moths, something like 94% of our moths, are overwintering in that fallen leaf layer. So when you blow or rake away all of your leaves and put them in bags and send them to the landfill, you are literally wiping out whole populations and generations of these pollinating wildlife that are going to be the food source for the birds that you're trying to attract. So the best thing that you can do is leave your leaves on your property this fall. Yes, they're going to smother your lawn. That's not a bad thing. What I always say is maybe reduce your lawn a little bit. Use those fallen leaves to smother part of it and make a new bed. But even if you can't do that, move as many of those leaves as you can into your garden beds. Use them as Mother Nature intended, as natural mulch and natural fertilizer. Think about it. You've got the tree, it drops its leaves, covers the root zone, right, where it retains soil moisture, suppresses weeds, and slowly composts, returning the nutrients right to the roots of the plants. That is literally fertilizer and mulch, right? Yet we've been trained by conventional gardening to throw it all away and then go out and buy those things. So you can recycle and build wildlife habitat and save yourself a buck just by raking those. Generally speaking, I recommend 2 to 5 inches, depending on what kind of leaves you have, how much other mulch is there. When the perennial plants, their tops die back, you can cover them That's what happens in nature. They get covered by leaves, and that protects the roots in the soil. Now, again, 10 inches of leaves is too much. You're going to smother the plant. But a few inches is fine. And they are going to break down. They are going to compost down. And my rule of thumb in my own yard is that I put enough leaves. So for me, it's usually about 3 inches or so deep that are going to still be providing a mulch benefit by the end of March. Usually by then, they've mostly broken down and composted back into the soil. And that's right when the plants are coming up. And I plant so densely that I don't need to mulch in the spring because the leaves of the plants actually fully cover the soil. So long answer, fall maintenance, generally speaking, don't do anything. Leave your stem standing. Use your fallen leaves as natural mulch. If you have too many leaves, still try to keep them on your property. Make a leaf pile in the back corner. Put them in your compost bin. That's less beneficial to the wildlife, but it's much better than sending them to the landfill where they get buried underground. They break down without oxygen, and then they produce methane, which is a hugely potent greenhouse gas causing climate change. And landfills are like the third biggest source of methane. So it's a big deal. And each of us has our little opportunity to make a difference, both for wildlife and habitat, but also climate change, simply by keeping our leaves on our property. And again, like I said earlier, when I do it and you do it and the neighbor does it, it really adds up and it makes an exponential difference. So that is my soapbox on Leave the Leaves. October is Leave the Leaves month. We're going to be talking a lot more about it then, but at the National Wildlife Federation. So anyway, it sounds like we're out of time, Julie.
Yes, I don't want to hold you all night. I think this is a lot of great information. Thank you so much for taking the time. I did see some questions. The recording of this will be available on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We will also post some links to some of the resources we mentioned. And I think this was a really great conversation. So maybe we'll do another one day.
I would love to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. Thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to future live streams with David.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.